Hello and welcome. I am Lian Buon and this is Rappler Talk. The unthinkable has happened. ABS-CBN Channel 2 was forced to go off the air the first time since the dictatorship under martial law. The cease and desist order against ABS-CBN fits right into the Duterte administration's streak of novel legal actions. And to talk more about that is a journalist from ABS-CBN, Mike Navallo, who covers the Justice Beat and has been covering this issue since the filing of the quo warranto petition before the Supreme Court. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Lian. Good to see you.
Please tell us about the news that you broke last night about the letter of Solicitor General Jose Calida to the NTC, I believe on April 30.
Yes, but it basically puts pressure on the NTC to issue a cease and desist order to ABS-CBN, considering that, the franchise of ABS-CBN lapsed on Monday. This is new because in the press release that the Solgen released on Sunday, there was no mention of a cease and desist order. It was just an advice saying that the commissioners of the NTC will be liable if they issue a provisional authority for ABS-CBN to continue operating despite the lapse of the franchise. So that's why that makes it new.
Mike, why is this a big deal? Why is the letter from the OSG signed by, I guess, 6 Assistant Solicitor Generals to the NTC a big deal in this context?
Well, how many times do you have a Solicitor General telling the NTC or any of its client for that matter? Because remember, the context is that the Solgen is the statutory council of government agencies. So why do you have a lawyer telling your client that you can't do this if the client wasn't asking for an advice or an opinion? So it somehow gives you an idea of the interest, the kind of interest that Solicitor General Jose Calida has in this case, and it makes you wonder because he also filed this quo warranto petition against ABS-CBN in February. So why is he so interested in having ABS-CBN closed?
Siguro put it in the context of also your report last year about the OSG's interest, special interest in cases that involve, I guess, opposition, members of the opposition, or anyone who's deemed to be a dissenter in government.
Yes, and you can see that in the case of Bicoy. Bicoy was, let's remember, Bicoy was one of the respondents in a complaint for sedition, inciting to sedition. Eventually, he became an accused in the cases that were filed by the Department of Justice against former Senator Antonio Trillanes. And so you would wonder, why would the Solgen be interested in helping draft the affidavit of someone who's being accused of committing a crime, when the Solgen should be representing, ideally, he should be representing government agencies in cases before the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court when it comes to criminal cases.
And I guess let me just add that it was also Solicitor General Jose Calida who initiated or asked for an investigation against Rappler before the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's why we were issued a shutdown order in 2018. Okay, going back to the ABS-CBN case, you wrote, and you were correct, the letter undermines the advice of the Department of Justice. Can you quickly walk through us the DOJ advice? What did Justice Secretary Monarda Guevara say?
Well, Justice Secretary Monarda Guevara was saying that in the absence of any law governing the rights and the obligations of someone, like an entity who has a franchise already, but that franchise lapses and is still in the process of renewing that franchise. So in the absence of any law governing the situation, you should be able to apply principles of equity in allowing the NTC to issue a provisional authority so that these entities can continue operating despite the lapse of the franchise. It's saying that you have to take into consideration the peculiar situation they're in, especially if it's not their fault. If Congress refused to act on their particular petition or their application. So that was what SOJ Guevara was saying. But in his letter, Solicitor General Jose Calida said you cannot actually consider grounds of equity when the law is very clear. The law says you have to have a franchise before you can apply for a certificate of public convenience. And while applying for a certificate of public convenience from the NTC, you will be issued a provisional authority. That's the only context that you will be given a provisional authority. So he's saying The DOJ position could be wrong. He cited the case, ACWS case, saying that even a DOJ legal opinion was struck down by the Supreme Court because it was erroneous, according to the Supreme Court, for the NTC to issue a provisional authority when there was no franchise to begin with.
Let me just go back to what you're saying about the law being clear. And this law was cemented further in 2003. Yun nga binanggit mo yung ACWS versus NTC, which says the NTC could only give a provisional permit to someone who has a franchise, or only a Congress-issued franchise can be the basis for a broadcaster to operate. Now, Justice Secretary Guevara is saying there is a gap in the law. What is that gap if that's what the Supreme Court had already said?
In that case, you have a first-time applicant of a franchise. So there was no franchise to begin with, so he really cannot operate without a franchise, even if he's given a provisional authority. But in this case, you have ABS-CBN, for example, or any other company for that matter, who have been or has been operating for a long time and has proven that you have the capability to actually exercise that franchise, but you find yourself in a situation where Congress just won't act on your petition. In this particular case, 4 years? Your application remains pending in Congress. So what do? I mean, what are your rights under the law? What are your obligations? There's nothing in the law that says that. So Secretary Guevara is saying we could apply principles of equity in this case to say that we can grant them a provisional authority pending the resolution of their application in Congress.
And as pointed out by your lawyers in the petition for TRO kanina, in fact, they had done so in some of broadcasters whose franchise renewal was ongoing when it had already expired.
Yeah, they cited 5 cases, in fact, and in one of those cases, they were allowed to operate for about 2 years after the lapse of the franchise. So if in those cases, those instances in the past, the government allowed them to operate even without a franchise, and NTC did not issue a cease and desist order, why is ABS-CBN treated differently? And this makes the whole issue of the Solgen actively pressuring the NTC to issue the CDO more emphasized, more pronounced, because you really have an interest in closing down this particular station, this particular media network. So you bring in the question of equal protection clause. Is there a substantial distinction between the case of ABS-CBN and the case of the other 5 companies who were allowed to continue operating even with the lapse of their franchise?
Good point. Let me just linger on the ACWS NTC issue. So yung situation wherein you want to renew a franchise but you can't because the Congress has been acting on it. It's a situation na nag-exist na nung 1990s because there was a confusion post-martial law.
Yes.
And because nagkakagulo-gulo yung mga broadcasters, there was a memorandum of understanding, MOU, among, I think, House of Representatives and associations of broadcasters that said, okay, for the next 2 years, while we act on your franchise bills, you're gonna be allowed to broadcast. At ini-invoke siya ng ilang supporters, or at least ng mga congressmen who supports a provisional authority. So, does that MOU come into play anywhere here? Is that MOU still valid, I guess, is the question.
Well, to begin with, the MOU mentions a specific date. I believe it's just valid until the end of 1994. So you have Secretary Guevara saying that the MOU might have to be refreshed if we're going to apply that to the present context. And also, I think personally, the context by which the MOU was meant to apply does not apply here, because there you have fresh applications as a result of the confusion from the previous laws that have been passed. That is not present here, because now you have a unified law. You have a clear law in place that this is the procedure, this is what's going to happen. And unfortunately, according to Secretary Guevara, it doesn't really provide for a situation where you are renewing your franchise and you're still waiting for action on that.
You know, in February, I think, or in March, we were on news break chats, and Ma'am Chai Hopelania asked me if anong tingin ko mangyayari. And I said, well, Justice Secretary Monarda Guevara, the alter ego of the president, has already gone on record to say pwede. Pwede silang makapag-operate past May 4. And I was that confident because he's the SOJ. In the hierarchy ba, sino bang mas matimbang? The OSG or the DOJ?
Well, I mean, it's up to the president, I guess. No, well, they have a set of, I guess, functions. The OSG is supposed to represent government agencies, in particular litigations that involve them. The Secretary of Justice is supposedly has a broader scope, primarily tending to the criminal justice system, the prosecution of cases. But as you know, the SOJ is also being consulted about the legality of various acts. So you don't really have a clear-cut distinction of, who gets to advise the president on which particular matter. And again, that I think is the weakness of our system. Personally, I thought that was enough. I thought that you have the SOJ saying that this is what's going to happen. You have the Senate and the House seemingly agreeing. In fact, they agreed because they came up with a resolution, and the House came up with a letter.
They agreed because they gave such deference to the SOJ.
Yes.
I remember that hearing na sobrang pinuri-puri siya, and because they have such high regard for him, they said, okay, we're gonna follow him.
Exactly. So what happened? I mean, suddenly the Solgen is higher than Congress and the SOJ.
As far as opinions go, in the first place, the NTC formally requested the DOJ for a legal opinion. So, itong legal opinion na to, it's not legally binding on the requesting agency, but we have seen so many times na sa isang kaso, whoever's being sued uses a DOJ legal opinion to their defense. And the Secretary of Justice has said in his interviews the past few days that he cannot give a legal opinion to a case that involves a private party, and in this case, ABS-CBN. What can you say about that? Do you know of a case where may private party involved pero nag-legal opinion pa rin yung DOJ?
Well, if the SOJ says that, I'll respect that. But there's a case in 2018 involving na yung Pilipino, if I'm not mistaken, and a private entity. They certainly issued a legal opinion, so I'm not sure why they can't issue one here. But of course, if that's the opinion of the Justice Secretary, then that's it.
Right. So we see this clash now between Solicitor General and the Justice Secretary, even though he says that it's not a clash. And then we saw the other day the clash between Justice Secretary and the presidential spokesperson. Clashes are not new to any administration. Laging may clash ang branches of government. So it's legislative versus judiciary, or judiciary versus the executive. Ngayon, silang cabinet men yung nagka-clash. What are your thoughts on this? Kasi it's a pronounced clash.
Yes, and it's happening not just in this case. It's happening most of the time. I mean, we've just had a cabinet secretary resigning because apparently his views do not conform to the views of the others. I mean, it should be healthy.
To Neda.
The secretary, well, it should be. I mean, dissent should be welcomed in the cabinet, and people should have a way of reconciling those differences. But the important thing is for the cabinet or for the executive to come out with a single stand. If you have your cabinet officials contradicting each other, it doesn't actually paint a good picture of the kind of governance that's happening. Because I mean, in the parlance of millennials, I mean, wala ba kayong group chat? Wala ba kayong nag-uusap-usap?
Just a last point on NTC and provisional authorities. So, the Supreme Court said nga na you cannot issue a provisional authority without a franchise. And before, sinasabi ni Justice Secretary Guevara, okay, sige, to as a workaround to respect the exclusive right of Congress to issue a franchise, why not just grant a provisional authority via a concurrent resolution? And then we saw yung latest statement niya just before the cease and desist order. He made no mention of provisional authorities or concurrent resolutions. And then the statement of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines nagbago din from not supporting provisional authorities to supporting provisional authorities. Bakit kaya ganon? I mean, does that the case that this is not really legal but political, given that the Congress could very well just solve this problem right now?
Well, that could be true. I mean, I think we have to ask them why they have this changing opinions from time to time. But the reality is that this is really a political question. I mean, political problem in a sense that, it could have been resolved easily by Congress convening and deciding to whether or not to grant that franchise to ABS-CBN.
I think we all agree that this is a political problem, most of all, more than a legal problem. Do you think this was a political problem that would get to this? Did you really expect that the shutdown was going to happen from the day that the co-warranto petition was filed?
Yes, for me, the fact that Solgen went to the extent of filing this, it means that, is really, at least there's one faction in the executive that's really bent on closing down ABS-CBN. I mean, you won't file a co-warranto petition a few days before the franchise lapses for no reason. I mean, that shows you how serious and how interested he is in having it closed down. And the fact that that didn't happen by the time the franchise lapses, he resorted to something else. He resorted to telling his own client that, you should issue a cease and desist order. That to me was a sign that, things could go wrong. I mean, the worst thing could happen is that we're going to be shut down.
Right. So we saw TV Patrol back in business kanina, albeit on Facebook.
Yes.
But what was the immediate mood or morale of the newsroom when the television screen went black? Did you have a mourning period kahapon? How was it?
No, well, me personally, I probably should exclude myself from that from the discussion, probably because I probably have a different reaction. I was more of indignant. Well, part of me was really angry and frustrated, maybe, but it's more of, we're gonna fight this. This is unjust. This shouldn't have happened, and so we'll do whatever we can to fight this. So if it means speaking out in various platforms, we'll do it. It's a privilege not to be able to think about, what will happen to your children if you lose your job. And until now, I still receive messages asking, do we have a fair shot in this petition, or in this petition that we filed with the Supreme Court earlier?
So what is your answer?
It's hard to say. I mean, that's the most difficult part. I cannot assume how the Supreme Court will act, but it's unfortunate because at the bottom line of this is really politics, and you have the lives of 11,000 people suddenly put at the crossroads because some people want to play politics. We were supposedly on skeleton force because of the pandemic, but many people actually stayed in the newsroom waiting for that moment, just being there, standing, being quiet in the corner, looking at the TV screens. And you feel like you saw probably the clip that I shot the moment we went black. There were just people clapping. It was more of people trying to gracefully exit and go out with dignity intact. I mean, we are going out on our own terms. We didn't want to wait for the tanks or perhaps the police to come in and close us down. So they decided to comply. Well, at least with your head up high. No? I mean, you sort of make the decision that we will do this, we will comply, and we will show that we will fight it out within the confines, within the bounds of the law. So that's what ABS-CBN is doing. They're trying to resort to a legal remedy that's available for them to be able to go back to air.
All right, Mike. So you're not exactly the favorite reporter of Solicitor General. Secondly, the more so
How would you know?
More so, well, we saw it. I shot that video of you being asked, lawyer ka ba? Does this have a chilling effect on you, not just a journalist in general, but as a journalist covering the OSG?
But ironically, no. To me, that's more of this is weird. It actually inspires me more to be more aggressive and to be more, let's just say, watchful of the actions of the OSG. I find it a challenge to be able to show that we're not intimidated. We're going to do our job because in the first place, we're not doing this for any other purpose than to report on what's really happening.
I'm going to ask you this because this is a question often asked of me.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find it difficult to cover yourself? That you have now, I mean, you meaning ABS-CBN, has now become the story.
And when you say covering yourself, you're referring to ABS-CBN as an
Yeah,
institution.
the ABS-CBN as an institution and the petition and now the cease and desist order.
Yes, I think it's quite difficult because aside from the fact that of course, there's the usual pressure of trying to get the story right, trying to be first, and trying to explain it as best as possible. There's also the added pressure that your bosses are watching and they'll be expecting you to perform well. And it's just being honest, diba? Pag if Maria is there, you probably are on your toes. So hi, Ma'am Jing. So, diba? Especially if I mean, imagine so while the whole Kalida confrontation was happening, the bosses were messaging on the Viber group, and so you check your Viber group and then you also report, and imagine the pressure that does that that situation builds on you. You really have to be able to handle it, and siguro you just have to take it an incident at a time. I mean, after the confrontation, I had to report live for Channel 2, report for ANC, and just get over it because it happened. It was an episode that happened, and then you just have to do your job. So I just make sure that there's no conscious attempt on my end to put in a favorable say information just to be able to defend my employer. If say the employer hasn't issued any statement yet, I'll say we're still waiting for management to issue a statement. So far, this is what's going on. This is what they said before, and these are the allegations. These allegations have not yet been answered. So I try to do that, but of course, people reading or people who are watching will probably not be able to see the effort because they'll just probably assume that you're just gonna write in favor of ABS-CBN because that's your company. But the struggle is actually internal. It's more of keeping yourself in check. It also applies in interviews that we grant to other media outfits. If you try to spouse your company's position, but so far, well, I'd like to think that I've perhaps managed to be able to do a decent job of trying to keep it fair. And if there's something that needs to be explained, it's to be said from the other side, I'd be more than willing to also write it. So yeah, of course, feel free to disagree.
All right, no, I'm not gonna disagree. So as a last note, as my last question, so everybody knows now that you're a lawyer. Solicitor General Jose Calida made sure that everybody knew that. So you left that to become a journalist, and now that your company has shut down, at least in the interim, do you still think it was worth it becoming a journalist in this time?
Well, I can say yes. My intention for being a journalist was really at first. I just really wanted to experience being a journalist because I've always wanted to be a journalist, but circumstances led me to working for a law firm. No regrets because I don't think I'd be able to find myself in this particular situation, which I consider to be part of history now. These are rare times. It's a rare privilege to be at the front seat of history, writing it, and also watching it unfold. But it also has it also has the disadvantage of you being able to, sometimes being helpless in when you cover a story, for instance, and the lawyer in you wants to intervene and say, hey, that's not correct, that's not right, this is not what's supposed to happen. You want to tell the police, you can't just do that because you can't just hurt these people. uh, but you can't do that as a journalist. I mean, you have to also weigh whether um, your actions are, you're acting as a journalist or you're acting as a lawyer for these people. So it's also a balancing act, which I try to do every day. You don't want to be accused of lawyering for anyone, but at the same time, if you're in the pursuit of truth, if you know that something is wrong, you just can't resist from or desist from telling the truth just because you're being accused of
Cease
lawyering
and
for anyone,
desist.
right? Yeah. Or stop from you know doing that. So it's a balancing act. No regrets. I mean,
So it's worth it. It's
it's
worth
worth
it.
it. It's worth it. I mean, if I were to stop being a journalist at this point and move on to perhaps probably be a lawyer, I wouldn't regret the 5 years, close to 5 years that I've been with ABS-CBN because I've experienced a lot. No regrets. Everything, all the experiences, I will take with me, whatever probably profession or path I choose to take in the coming months or coming years. But
All
I
right.
hope to stay.
All right. Let's end on that note. Thank you so much. That has been Mike Navallo of ABS-CBN News. Thank you for watching Rappler